Up and live. Okay, so we are going to, as I said, start from chapter 9, Mishnah 12. This is the very last section of chapter 9. And if you remember, we were finishing off the concept of what happens if you steal from somebody who is a convert, which means that they don't have any legal heirs within the people of Israel, assuming they don't have children yet. And then, or the person who's returning it dies, and all of the weird little hypotheticals. Okay, so that's where we are. So now we are on chapter 9, Mishnah 12. And Harriet, for the last time before you go back up, well, back out west and then up north, and who knows where else.
Yes, my pleasure. 1, if he who had stolen from the convert gave the money to the men of the priestly watch and then died, his inheritors cannot recover it from the priest's hands, as it says, whatsoever a man gives to a priest shall be his.
Okay, so if he had lived long enough to, if he had died earlier and not given the money to the priests, then he would not be, his estate would not be liable for it. So the question is, what happens if he gave the money but hasn't actually done the sacrifice? Could his heirs say, well, Dad never actually completed the process, therefore the money doesn't really count as being given back, so we should have it? And the Mishnah is saying, no. We don't play that game, right? Once he already had paid that which he was supposed to pay, even if he didn't complete the whole process before he died, it stays with the Kohanim, and we're done. It doesn't return back. We're going to deal more long day. We're going to deal more with the question of what happens to the children of a robber when the robber dies in chapter 10. So if you have questions about that, just hold them for now. Well, you know, people leave behind credit card debt and student loan debt and all sorts of other debt. What about I'm a thief debt?
I never thought of the rights of thieves, or if they're children, the rights of thieves. Wow. It sort of seems like an oxymoron. They shouldn't have any rights. Well, but I guess they do.
I mean, it took a long time, but our own country also, when we were founded, believed that people who were accused of a crime had rights, that people who were even convicted of crimes had rights. That's the cruel and unusual punishment prohibition. So we have, at least in the modern world, caught up with the idea of the Torah and the Mishnah, that yes, people who have done something wrong are still human. And they definitely deserve their punishment. And they also deserve to still be human. And that's not an oxymoron. That's in fact how you ensure that you are administering justice rather than vengeance.
And coming up, we have a couple of words that I don't think we know. Yehoyariv
yes.
and Yedaya.
Okay, so those are actually the different watches. So there was a cycle of taking turns. If you, not that kind of watches. Shifts.
So
shifts.
Shifts of who was
which Kohanims were on duty at which time.
Okay.
Right. So here's the problem. Everybody who's a Kohen can technically, if they're ritually pure and all of that, officiate at different services and sacrifices at the temple. If you were a Kohen, why would you be anywhere else? But if you're all at the temple, it's going to create a bit of a mob scene, right? Every Kohen waiting, I'll do your sacrifice, come. You don't want him doing your sacrifice, let me do your sacrifice. Because the Kohen knows that whoever is the one who does the sacrifice gets to keep the pieces, right? Gets the food, or if there's money that goes along with it, he gets the cash, right? So the Kohanim are going to be in competition. In order to avoid the competition, they were divided into shifts, so that when it was your shift, then you were the one who would be doing it, and it wasn't your shift, stay out of the temple.
How was the quality of life of the Kohanim? Like they had. Were
they rich? Were they poor?
Yeah, they had a lot of income. Not usually the Kohanim.
Yes and no. So some Kohanim seem to have done pretty well, and we know from Second Temple times there were some Kohanim that were almost like aristocracy. Their family was very well off, and there were some Kohanim that were very poor.
But if they receive, they have whatever they receive. So how could it be that someone was richer than the others? If everyone is there in the temple, so whoever is there is whoever receives.
If I give everybody in this room $10,000 and come back 2 years from now
That's right.
Do you think you're all going to have the same?
No, exactly not. That's right.
And so with the Kohanim, right? So some of them took what they had received and they were able to make it grow. Some took what they received and weren't, and some were in the middle. So there was up and down. And not to put too fine a point on it, politics, especially in the Second Temple period, played a big part of it. There was often interference by the Herodian government, the Herodian kingship, into who would be privileged in different ways for receiving special consideration by the kingly family and by other nobles. So politics played a big role in it.
To bribe them, to be nice to the king or whatever they do.
Yeah, don't throw etrogs at me. That's an actual real story of one of the, actually it was one of the Ashmonean kings got pelted with etrogs because he was not doing things correctly. So just imagine if your politician was there in front of you doing the ritual wrong and everybody has a hard fruit in their hand. It's just, no, whack. But imagine the goal to throw something at the king. All right, anyway, that's a whole nother story. All right, so we're talking about two different ships.
The morning, like in the evening, or something like that.
And now you know why the Romans didn't consider the Jews governable, right? I mean, if we would do that to our own king, think what we're going to do with a foreigner.
It's also very interesting that the kind of way of the democratization, that you can see the Mishnah, but you see the real life also, that if people can say to the king, hey, you're doing something wrong, and throw you whatever they want to throw them, show you that maybe they see that the king is someone temporary, like that not have the complete authority that they maybe had a Caesar or any other king in other kingdom.
Right. I mean, the basic, maybe too much of a tangent, but the basic concept within Judaism was the king may have been in position because of God, although the Hashmonean kings not so much. But in general, let's imagine that the king is there because he's part of the Davidic line. The Hashmoneans were not. And therefore, God has chosen that this person would be king. The rest of us also say, yeah, God chose us too. Right? So you may be in a particular and unique position of authority because God knows that we need somebody in charge around here. But that doesn't make you better than us. That doesn't make you able to do things wrong. We are still allowed to criticize you. There's some limits to that, but it is definitely a nascent form of rule of a constitutional monarch, because we all follow the same constitution, the Torah.
And part of that, actually, not only have we always had chutzpah, but we're all created equal.
That's why God picked us.
Yes, our view is not that there are higher and lower peasants and kings, but that we're all equal in the eyes of God. So just because he's king, if he's doing something wrong, I can see. I never thought about that, but you can throw an etrog at him because.
Well, that's not usually recommended, but.
No, definitely not. Definitely not recommended. But I can see how the feelings would be there because you don't think of someone as high or low. We're all equal. Right. The king's eye is worth more than my eye, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. We're all equal.
Right.
Very interesting.
All right. So now that we know what we're doing with these shifts, let's see how different shifts will affect the ritual.
So we're on point 2.
Right.
If he gave the money to Yehoyariv and the guilt offering to Yedaiah.
Right. He gave the money to shift A, sacrifice to shift B.
Okay, so then he gave the money first.
Right.
He has fulfilled his obligation.
Right. Even though it didn't go to the same priest, it went to the priests, and that was okay. And we're going to flip things around, of course.
But if he gave the guilt offering to the earlier shift and then the money to the later shift, if the guilt offering still remains, the sons of Yedaiah shall offer it. Otherwise, he must bring another guilt offering.
Right. So if he handed off the animal, and then he went and got the money, and by the time he came back with the money, the shifts had changed, but the animal had not been sacrificed yet. Right. It was waiting in line for sacrifice. That's okay. The new shift can sacrifice the animal and receive the money. On the other hand, if the animal is already gone, then you got to get a new animal. Right? The animal doesn't work without the cash. And we're going to explain why that happens in just a second.
Is that partly because the priest who sacrificed the animal gets to eat part of it? So if he had sacrificed it earlier, he gets to eat that with his family, sort of.
Not exactly.
Shift,
right. Not exactly in this case.
Gone.
Right. In this case, the issue is not who gets to eat the animal. In this case, the issue is, what does the sacrifice represent in this whole process?
Okay.
Right? Is the sacrifice, well, let's see the Mishnah. It explains it better than me.
Part B, if a man brought what he had stolen before he offered his guilt offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. So if he returned what he stole before he brings the guilt offering, he's fulfilled it.
Right.
But if he brought his guilt offering before he returned what he had stolen, he has not yet fulfilled his obligation.
All right. So this is one of the fundamental truths of Judaism, and something very important to consider as we're getting close to Elul and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is you can't bring a sacrifice to God admitting your guilt if you haven't actually fixed the thing that you're admitting your guilt over. Right? So yeah, I stole $5,000 from this guy. I am wrong. I'll hate, right? I shouldn't have stolen.
Yeah.
Here, have my sacrifice. And the $5,000 is still in my pocket. That doesn't work. Right? No, that doesn't just mean people don't try. Right? That's what people try all the time, is to offer up a token of forgiveness without actually fixing the problem. And the Mishnah is very clear here and many, many other instances that it just doesn't work like that. If you don't have contrition, if you're not actually sorry for what you did, and by sorry I mean you're doing something about it, and in this case it's really obvious what you need to do, which is return the stolen thing, then the sacrifice is worthless. Right? It's just an animal. It's livestock, right? It's just the beast. And therefore, if you bring the money first and then bring the sacrifice later, that's okay. But if you flip it around, the animal that died on the altar, that wasn't for anything, because you had not fixed the problem by the time it was slaughtered. Okay. And then we're going to just do one more little wrinkle, not too complicated.
If he gave the value, but not the added fifth, the added fifth does not prevent him from offering the guilt offering.
Right. So, but if he's for some reason able to get the actual value back that he needed to owe them, or that he owed them because that's what he had taken, and he did the guilt offering, but he hasn't returned the value that was the penalty, he's still okay. He's done what he needed to do for the guilt offering. The guilt offering is still sufficient. He doesn't have to bring another animal. He does still owe the extra money.
We saw the same idea before last week.
Yeah.
This seems to be quite different. I can see how Christianity may have evolved, because in Christianity you don't have to fix what you did wrong to ask for forgiveness. You get forgiven.
Right.
Whereas in Judaism, what you're saying is, first you have to fix what you did wrong. You stole my $5,000. Don't say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, give it back to me, forgive me, please." You have to give it back, or there's none. And that's quite different.
That's a very interesting topic, because we were talking about that, and being that I'm in a Christian environment, they have that problem. And when I was raised as a Christian, my grandfather would always say, "You have to make things right." Totally different concept.
That's right.
Than these people that they were like, "Oh, you're forgiven. You don't even have to look at that person anymore. Everything is okay." No. Fix it.
What drove me crazy was when the boys killed the students in Colorado, and I hear on the radio, I'm hearing that the killer is being forgiven. We forgive him. He didn't fix what he did wrong. His kids are still dead. I never had heard something like that before, where you could forgive. What about the mothers of these children who are crying their eyes out? You're forgiving him?
Well, so not to go too much down the rabbit hole of other theologies, but what you're describing is core theology versus culture.
Yeah.
Right. So many Christian cultures absolutely recognize that you have to make things right, and that is the ideal, and that is the way to live, and that should be right. But if you push hard enough in the core theology, which is not meant to be an excuse for not fixing problems, but the core theology is meant to be in Christianity a realization that human beings can't fix their problems.
Yeah.
Right? That you need to have someone else. You need to have someone else fix it for you. I mean, that's the whole idea of the sacrifice for sins and all of those things.
Right.
So in Judaism, it doesn't work like that, right? You are fully empowered, you are fully enabled, and you are fully capable of fixing your mistakes, because God has chosen to work with us to let us fix those mistakes. And that's our theology. And but it is important to point out, as Michelle said, that many, and I'd say the vast majority of Christians don't rely on the core theology to get out of their problems. They do believe that they should make things right. And they do try to make things right as much as we do. It's just dig deeper, and then you see the sharper distinction.
But
And
what annoys me is when they utilize that
That's
Yes.
right.
as an excuse to not make
Not
things
making
right
it.
and not grow, because you're growing as a person and you're growing spiritually closer to Hashem when you actually do things right. And so then when you miss that point, you're not going nowhere. You're still staying immature, not growing, you know.
right. Well, certainly that's Judaism's perspective.
Yes.
Is that we even say that the person who has done tshuva, that is to say, a person who did something wrong, has fixed what they did wrong, is able to stand in a place that somebody who was righteous their whole life can never stand. Right? That there is a certain spiritual growth that comes
That's right.
from having made a mistake and fixed the mistake. That for people who have never made mistakes, they can't quite appreciate spiritually that same feeling.
As a parallel to that,
Mhm.
I was brought up Jewish, kosher. I have never had a cheeseburger. So what?
Right.
However,
You're not
really,
missing anything.
I really honor people who have had that
Mhm.
or lobster and voluntarily give it up to become Jewish because they know what they're missing, and I think they are on a higher spiritual plane than I, who never even has to think about it.
And
then
that is a
you know,
Talmudic idea.
Isn't
Right.
it? Because I've
Yes.
always thought, wow, you actually know what that is. You gave it up. That's really something.
Trust me, I know exactly what oysters taste like.
Yeah.
And I haven't had any in, well, now like 30 some years.
Wow,
So-
that is, it's really something. For that, you have to really want to do it. You have to
Of course.
really, it has to be very meaningful.
Not to downplay the fact that somebody who has resisted,
Yeah.
wondering what it's like,
Ah,
and has
yeah.
gone against how they were raised and had that head start, if you will,
Oh,
that is also still an accomplishment. To be able to maintain oneself without tripping
Yeah.
is still a big accomplishment. So, but they're different accomplishments.
yes.
They're different.
Yeah. Wow.
And by the way, the rabbis in the Talmud, and I also agree, this is not meant to encourage you to deliberately go out and do something wrong,
So it's-
just so you can have the spiritual benefit of fixing it on the other side.
Oh, darn.
The Mishnah in Yoma, the section that deals with Yom Kippur, you wouldn't know. The Mishnah actually, oh no, not just me. The Mishnah in Yom Kippur, for Yom Kippur and Yoma at the very end says, somebody who sins and says Yom Kippur will atone for me, Yom Kippur provides no atonement. Right? You don't get to preemptively rely on this as an excuse for sinning, fixing, sinning, fixing, sinning, fixing. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. This is for handling your mistakes, not your gaming of the system.
Oh, wow.
So no one, I just ruined everybody's night plans. They're all going to be going out of a wild night of debauchery because then they could stand on a higher plane. Sorry, doesn't work like that. But all of us, whether we like it or not, make plenty of mistakes that give us a chance to fix things and have that spiritual
All
growth.
right, yes.
Okay, chapter 10.
Chapter 10, Mishnah 1. Mishnah, this is one.
This is Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1. If a man stole something and fed it to his children, or if he left it in front of them, they are exempt from making restitution.
Okay?
Yeah.
So if I go out and I steal 10 pounds of meat and I come home and I feed the 10 pounds of meat to my children, then they probably could finish it. And then I die without having actually made restitution. They do not have to make that restitution. However, if there is still 5 pounds of meat left, that they do have to return. Right? So if I steal something and give it to my kids, and it's with my kids, that they are able to return it, then they have to return it, yes.
How would they know if you stole it?
Well, that's for normal criminal procedures, right? So you have to have witnesses and all of those sorts of things.
Okay.
So we don't go by just casual circumstantial evidence. So, that looks a lot like my cow. We need a little bit more evidence than just that.
Maybe as a parent doing that, you should have let your kids know, listen, I have to do this.
Oh, that side. Right.
I need to do this, or something
Right.
like that.
Well, in the ideal community, a person should not need to steal to feed their children. The community should ensure that anybody in their community who is hungry or whose children are hungry is supported by the community until they are able to take care of themselves. So this should be only dealing with people that are not behaving well. This should not be the poor family who has to steal from the bakery in order to feed their children, and because no one will help. That should, God forbid, never be the case. This should be, you know what? I like those guys' oranges. I'm going to take some home for my kids. Not because my kids are hungry, because my kids like oranges. And, you know, why not take them? They're cheaper than paying at the grocery store. Right? Stealing is always cheaper than paying. That's why people steal. Okay. However, there is an important codicil on this.
And this is A.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was something which is subject to mortgage, that is real estate, they are liable to make restitution.
Right. So if you have something that can be mortgaged in order to get the value out of it, then you have to get that value out and pay it back to the estate, or not the estate, to the person that your father stole from. Right. If the value becomes embedded, if you will, into something that it can be easily extracted from, then that needs to be put back. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Part two.
Part two. One may not make change from the chest of an excise collector or from the wallet of tax collectors, or take any charity from them.
Okay, wait a minute, huh? How did we get to talking about excise collectors and tax collectors?
Oh, because they have money.
Because they're thieves.
Oh.
No.
Yeah, they
Okay,
just say
so
that.
the sages do not have the highest opinion of tax farmers. They generally felt that most of the customs duty people and the tax people were not honest in how they did their work. And if you understand how they did their work, you'll probably agree and understand why. So right now, if someone works for the IRS, right, let's say they're an auditor for the IRS, who pays them? The government, right? And do they get paid more if they do more audits?
No.
No, they get paid for doing their job. They get a salary, right?
They receive a percentage.
No.
No, in the Mishnah.
It's worse than that. So there were a couple different ways. Some of the tax collectors and the customs people were working off commission. Some of them, however, paid for the job.
In the Middle Ages.
Oh, the Middle Ages, that was all over Europe, right? So let's imagine that Natan is the king, right, or the governor or whatever. He wants taxes, but he wants a reliable, steady revenue source. So what does he do? He doesn't want to have to worry, are the people going to pay taxes? Are they not going to pay taxes? Is it a good year or is it a bad year?
You give you $100,000
Exactly.
a year, and whatever extra is for me.
Exactly right. So I give him, let's say, 1,000 gold pieces, and I buy the authority to tax this area. He gets his 1,000 gold pieces, and he's done. He doesn't have to worry about it anymore. And then I go to the local area, and I squeeze and cheat and lie and basically steal, but steal with the authority of the king, 1,000 plus as much else as I can get out of you. And that's my salary, is I get paid back for the money I gave him. When you read the story of Esther, and Haman is making the deal with Ahasuerus about the killing of the Jews, that's what they're negotiating. Where he says, I'll give you this amount of money if you let me do this to the Jews. They're working out when he attacks the Jews and he takes the spoils. How much money does he have to pay to the king for permission to do this? That's the kind of negotiation that's happening there. That's why it sounds so weird. It's like, what are they talking about, the money and the spoil? If they're bad, they're bad. Like, no, the king wants the money that he knows Haman is going to get something from taking all of the property of the Jews, and the king needs his cut, and the king gets his cut first, because it's good to be the king.
Nice.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why we had so many problems in Poland and Russia.
Oh, everywhere.
Because the Jews that were in charge of this, and the common people become to be upset and rebel against the person.
Specifically in the Ukraine. The Ukraine was conquered by Poland, and when the Poles conquered the Ukraine, they allowed Jews to come in and do colonize, to be homesteaders. That's how so many Jews ended up in the Ukraine. But when they moved in, the Ukrainians weren't happy to see their new neighbors, because where are these people coming from? And specifically, the Poles were willing to let the Jews have higher authority and to work as tax collectors and all of that. And so when the Ukrainians finally had a revolution against Poland, guess who they decided to hate most, right? Not just the Poles, but they decided to hate Jews even more than the Poles because we were the local face of the Polish invaders. And so that then became part of the long-standing anti-Semitism of against Jews in the Ukraine. So, yeah, it's a lot of history there. Okay, so back to our Mishnah. Now that we're thinking of our customs collectors and our tax collectors as being possible but probable thieves, now why can I not make change from his property?
And can't take any charity from it either.
Mm-hmm.
But it
why not?
Why not? Because they have stolen money.
Exactly, it's probably stolen goods.
Yeah.
Right? Remember, if I get change from him, then the money that he stole, he won't be able, when we catch him, to return to the person he stole it from because I will have changed it. Right? It's basically like I will have done money laundering with him. And so these people you don't want to touch their money, even for tzedakah, because most likely it's stolen property. Okay. And by the way, this does not mean that modern tax collectors are viewed the same way. This is the historical tax collectors.
No, they kind of sort of are. That's why they were trying to implement the changes with IRS.
Yeah, you start to sound like a Tea Party member.
It's one of those things where you have to read tax collector in the year 150 CE in order to understand what the issue is. Okay. But
money may be taken from them at their own house or in the market.
Right. There, it is assumed they're not carrying the money that they've stolen directly from someone else, but that it's their own money for themselves. It's like their own wallet. So you can't take it from them when they're doing business, but you can take it from them when they're on their own personal activity.
So if they're in the marketplace buying oranges, yeah, you can take their money. You don't have to.
You can get tzedakah from them then.
They can pay you with their money.
Right. Exactly.
What about if they want to give tzedakah to someone that comes to their house? Is that acceptable?
Yes, exactly. From their house, that's fine. Right.
Okay.
Because then it's considered, at least, because remember, we have no hard evidence that this person stole this coin. So we're going to assume that when they're doing their business, that most of the stuff in the business box is stolen. But we're going to assume that most of the stuff in their private pockets, that is not stolen.
Yeah, but the money from the pocket, from the private personal pocket, came from the business. So in some way, it's still stolen money.
So there's a possibility, yes, that it still is. But the difficulty for the sages is, then you would have to say, no one's allowed to take anything from the tax collectors ever. No one can sell them anything. You can't sell them a house. You can't sell them an orange. No one can take, tzedakah from them. And that was going too far because some tax collectors were probably honest, or at least pretty honest.
And part of the money that they got was theirs.
Right.
It wasn't all stolen.
No.
They were entitled to some. Maybe they got more than they should have been entitled to. Part of it
Exactly right.
Theirs that they could use.
And so the compromise was, from their business sack, no. From their personal sack, we will assume that the bulk of the money in the personal sack is okay, and we'll assume that there is enough suspicion on the business sack that it's not okay. But that's why they're going off assumptions, because they don't have proof of how much they've actually stolen. And as Ariad said, some of it they were entitled to, at least by the government authority, that they were allowed to tax. We just believe that they're probably how they're doing it, and that taints their business work, but not the other work. So yes, it's an unhappy compromise because of the horrible nature of government in the ancient world. It wasn't a pretty time to be alive. All right, we're going to carry on with this idea. Remember, Mishnah 2 of chapter 10.
First point: if excise collectors took his donkey and gave him another donkey, or if bandits robbed a man of his coat and gave him another coat, they are his own, since the original owners gave up hope of recovering them.
All right, so this is how bad it is, right? The tax collectors and robbers, they're in the same sentence.
Yeah.
And it's the same ruling, basically, which is introducing us to a concept that gets a lot of discussion when we talk about loss and found problems of yeush, of despair, right? If someone has given up all hope of ever reclaiming this, then it now is no longer considered to be their property. And so that means not that the thief is off the hook, but it means that the secondary person is allowed to accept it without having to feel like they're receiving stolen goods. So if he stole my donkey, the tax collector, and then gave me a different donkey, even though I'm pretty sure that donkey probably came from some other poor guy who had his donkey stolen, just like me, he's given up hope of ever seeing his original donkey ever again. So it's a free donkey. But of course, it's only because of that back and forth, right? If the tax collector is just bribing me with a donkey that he stole from someone else, I shouldn't touch it. I'm not allowed to accept gifts from people that are thieves. If you have reason to believe that it's actually a Thoven? Stolen. Oh, yes.
Oh.
Tongue is the first thing to start winding down at night. Okay.
Point 2.
On the other hand,
If a man saved something from a flood or from marauding troops or from bandits, if the owner gave up hope of recovering the item, it belongs to him.
okay, big if in the middle of that sentence, and one that the Talmud has to go into a lot of discussion about. But the basic general principle, with lots and lots of details that we don't have the time to go into tonight, is here we have a case where in all likelihood, the person who was the original owner has given up hope of ever seeing this thing again, right? Imagine that there's a big flood in Orlando and, all the contents of your house just wash down the road. And that's it, right? Do you think you're going to get them back? Or more importantly, if you are the person who sees them come washing down the road and you can't find any identification, you haven't heard of anybody who is looking for them, you haven't seen, or even better, someone has said, oh, everybody's given up hope of ever recovering the stuff ever again, then you're allowed to keep it. On the other hand, if you think there's a very good chance that the person will, like the flood only hit one house, well, then that one house is probably going to be able to get their stuff back, then you don't get to keep it. And like I said, this is a really complicated question of when do you and when do you not believe that someone has given up hope of recovering their stuff. And that's why the Talmud spends many, many pages on it. But that is the general principle. So this does not mean you have carte blanche to loot during a storm or during a raid of robbers. It just means if you come across something during those circumstances, you might get to keep it. Maybe. Make sense? Okay.
So too with a swarm of bees.
I love this part.
Yeah. If the owner gave up hope of recovering the swarm, it belongs to him.
Okay. So who wants bees?
Oh, yeah.
Honey, right? Honey is kind of important, right? So honey is very important, and bees as pollinators for fields and farms are very important, especially for orchards. So keeping a swarm in your yard was kind of important. And if the swarm left, you'd want it back. Those are my bees. On the other hand, it might be a little tricky to identify which bee is yours. Because I don't want to sound biased, but all bees look alike. So how do you tell which one is which? Do you put little name tags on them? So that's what we have to deal with. So if a swarm of bees comes into your property, if you believe the owner has given up looking for them, then you get to keep them. But now we're going to go into a little more detail of what that means.
So in point 4, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka said, a woman or child may be believed if they say, the swarm of bees went away from here.
Right? So if the kid shows up and says, hey, the swarm left our yard, that's our swarm, then you have to help them bring the swarm back to their property. Right? That's what you do. What's that? Well, usually it's a matter of sort of guiding them back. On the other hand,
a man may go into his fellow's field to save his swarm, and if he causes damage, he must pay for the damage that he has caused.
Right? So as I go to climb the fence to track down my swarm, I break your fence, I'm allowed to get into your property to get back my swarm, right? Because that's my property walking away there, flying away there. And I'm allowed to go after it. but I'm not allowed to damage your property to save my property. So I still have to pay you back for the damage that I have, and this is important in this part of the Mishnah, inadvertently done. However, he points out,
he may not cut off a branch of the tree to save his swarm, even on the condition that he pay its value.
Right, so you see the bees have all clustered around a branch, and you think, easy. I'll just hack the branch, carry the branch back to my area, and problem solved. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, you can't do that on purpose, right? You cannot break the branch and take it because you're breaking your neighbor's property.
But he's ready to pay.
And that
What?
can't be fixed.
Yes.
It can't
He's
be
ready
fixed.
to pay.
So if the neighbor agrees that you can take and damage the tree and pay for it, that's okay. This is talking about somebody who says to themselves, I'll break the branch and I'll come back and pay him later. Or even I'll what's that? It's if it's your decision alone, and if you and the neighbor work it out and say, hey man, I need my bees back, let me take this branch. And he's like, that branch cost me $500. All right, fine, $500 for the branch. That's okay. But if you say, oh, I'll just hack it down, and if he's bothered by it, I'll pay him later. And you don't get to make the decision of how to handle your neighbor's property without your neighbor's consent.
But the problem is his fence, he built the fence, he can fix the fence if you damage it. You can't put the branch back on the tree. Once you take that branch off, that can't be fixed.
True, but it might also be completely unuseful. Why do I need a branch?
But I can see why there's a difference between the property that can be repaired or this thing which you're now doing permanent damage to.
Even if it was they flew into a brick in the wall, and you can take the stone out and take that brick with you, the same rule will apply. Even though you can fix the wall easily, you're not allowed to damage someone else's property to save your own property without their consent.
But this says if he does cause damage, the beginning of it said he can go into the field to save his farm. If he happens to cause damage,
happens to it, right?
pays the damage.
It's
And,
inadvertent,
Oh.
not deliberate, right? That's why I gave the example of climbing over the fence. I kick one of the planks loose, or
Right.
I break the latch because I was trying to get in and I didn't know it was locked, or I stumble and break your chicken coop, right? Those are things where or more casually, I am running through your wheat field and I'm trampling your grain. Normally, I'm not allowed to do that to someone else's property. And in this case, I'm just, I need my bees. I love them so much. That is permitted. You don't have to stop at the property line and say, oh, I can't step on anything in there. I can keep going, but I'm not allowed to willfully cause damage that I know is damage. However,
Rabbi Yisrael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka,
and thank you for emphasizing that this is his son disagreeing with his father. Disagreed.
No, disagreed. He says he may even cut off the branch and repay the value.
Right, so he disagrees. He says, hack that branch and come back and pay him later.
Right.
Rabbi Tam and Rashi, they disagree most of the time.
Yes.
But this is father and son. That's
And the other one is a grandchildren.
right.
And
It's
the
father and
grandpa.
grandchildren,
Yes,
right?
that's it.
So
That's right.
it's not as unusual, but it is still a little surprising. And by the way, this continues to be a machloket in the halachic literature. Some of the poskim follow one, and some follow the other. So it's not an answer that is easily settled.
And this is without permission, correct?
Correct. Yeah, if your neighbor says, "Oh, take the
Because
branch, no problem."
You know what? That I think I tend to agree with Rabbi Ishmael, because it's the same as stealing. You repair. You're doing something bad and you fix it. That's why using the logic that we saw in the previous Mishnah,
Right.
if you apply the same logic, makes sense what Rabbi Ishmael said.
Right, but remember, you're not supposed to steal with the intent of repaying.
It's not. Yeah, well, cutting is like stealing because it's property.
You're deliberately damaging. I mean, let me put it this way: is it okay for me to punch you if I know I can pay the penalty? If I know that the court is only going to charge me $500 for punching you, can I just put $500 on the table and smack?
Not because you need to pay us all the damage to me by the Jewish law.
That's my point. If I know the court is only going to fine me, I mean, there's a maximum to how much it's going to cost me as damages for hitting you. So if I'm willing to pay the penalty, is it not a sin for me to go ahead and hurt you? right? If you say yes, then you're basically saying that if you have enough money, you can do whatever you want and pay the penalty. And that's not the attitude that the rabbis want to promote. Sorry for the example. All right. So now that we've dealt a little bit with this lost and found, we're also going to deal with what happens when you find your stuff with someone else who took it without your permission. It's like, hey, wait a minute.
I've seen that before.
I've seen that before. It looks awfully familiar. I didn't know your initials were the same as mine.
That was my aunt with my clothes.
Oh, really?
Come to my house, you take my clothes and then tell me, I have it, and never give it back.
Oh,
Okay. Speaking of making things right.
When King Shaul is looking for his donkey, how he find it? How he know that his donkey?
You don't know your pets?
Huh? Okay. That's,
Right.
that's the same way he's.
Right. So people can usually identify their stuff mostly, which is sort of what we're going to get into. Of exactly, well, you're going to see there's a bit of a problem of, well, wait a minute, that's mine, of why that isn't always a solution. All right, so let's go ahead and Mishnah 3.
Mishnah 3.1, if a man recognized his utensils or books in another's hands, and a report of theft had gone out in the town, the purchaser swears how much he paid and takes this price from the owner and restores the goods.
Okay? So what this is talking about here is I have a book, and you say, wait a minute, that's my book. And I say, really? I bought it off Frank, and I paid Frank $10 for this book. Right? I swear I paid Frank $10 for this book. Okay? Here's your $10. $10, give me my book.
You
Right.
have to pay for the person?
If you want the book back, yeah,
You have to pay.
you have to pay. Now, Frank can still be charged with theft. So you might still be able to get your $10 back because of Frank being prosecuted as a thief, and then you get your compensation. But me, the guy who ended up with the book, right? But it's only if the report of theft had gone out, because if it has not,
But if such a report had not gone out, the original owner does not have the power. For I might say he had first sold them to another, and this one bought it from him.
right? So it could be a scam. Hey, that's my book that I sold yesterday to someone else, right? And now I want it back, or now I'm going to try and use a different, price to try and somehow make a profit off of it. If no one knows that there's a theft, then why would people have been on the lookout for stolen things? And also, we need to make sure that people are not using this law to damage other people by coming back around the other way. So if something of yours is stolen, you have to let the community know, hey, my donkey was stolen. And then when you see someone else with your donkey, you can force him to give it back to you, but you have to give him compensation.
If he bought it from the thief.
If he bought it from, if he's a thief, if he is the
If he is
thief,
a thief, you don't have
that's a different issue.
The idea is he bought it from the thief in good faith,
Exactly.
and so he shouldn't have his money stolen from him either.
And that's, the problem is how do we balance these things? All right, I can't just come up and knock someone over and say, that was my book, give me it back. That's not going to make for a happy community. All right, so Mishnah 4 is on the same page, just trying to save a little paper.
Point 1, if one came with his jar of wine, and the other came with his jug of honey, and the jug of honey cracked, and the other poured out his wine, and saved the honey by receiving it into his jar, he can claim no more than his wages.
Okay, so, here's the issue.
Yeah.
You got it already?
No, I
Who's
have
he?
to comment something
Okay.
from the past.
Okay, so let's finish the wine and the honey. Because this is kind of a complicated. Okay. So so here we go. We got. Let's make it easier. We got Mr. H, and we got Mr. W. Right. One has honey, the other has wine, and they're both carrying these lovely jugs that I just drew. And the honey gets a crack. Right. That means the honey's going to start dripping out. And so I take my wine and I just dump it out. I dump out my wine. and I rush over to your jug and I put my jug underneath it. So now your honey plop, 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 drips into that jug. And I say, there you go, I rescued your honey. Do you have to pay me for the wine that I spilled?
I didn't ask you.
So that's the issue here, right? You didn't ask me to do it. You do have to pay me for my help, right? You do have to pay me for saving your honey. So whatever the going rate is, the minimum wage of honey rescuers are, that you have to pay me for, because I did work and I did you a service, and you need to compensate me for that. But the wine, you don't. However,
But if he had said, I will save what is yours and you pay me the value of mine, then the owner of the honey is liable to pay him back.
right, if I say, hey man, I'll dump out my wine and save your honey, and you go, yeah, then you're on the hook for my wine. They both agree. You know, it comes down to that so many times. If you agree, it's okay. If you don't agree, you're not allowed to make the decision for the other person. Only more people actually considered that. All right, Nathan, did you want to go back to your other question?
Yes.
Okay.
One second.
Is it sweet and sticky?
No. No, I was keeping thinking about the case of the son and the father, the Rabbi Ishmael.
Oh, about the branch.
Yes.
Yes, the swarm of
because-
bees.
No, it's more about this. The issue about to contradict your teacher, because in the Pirkei Avot it's very clear that you need to respect and follow your
Mhm.
teacher.
Right.
And it came to an extreme that one of the rabbis, I can't remember the name,
Mhm.
he say all the time, I only teach what my teachers say to me.
Right.
I cannot add anything else.
Mhm.
But in this case, he's contradicting his teacher. Forget about the father.
Right.
But it's the Rosh Yeshiva, okay? It's his teacher. And it's not problematical.
It depends.
Yeah, the rabbis contradict each other all the time.
Well, but no, hold on.
No, we're
But there's a
talking about
generational
the
difference.
Same school. The
Right.
same school about the rabbi, the teacher.
Okay.
Go against your teacher.
So looking at the clock, I think I can maybe explain this. This is really a very important idea. So we're going to have teacher 1, teacher 2, student A, student B, student X, student Y. All right. So between teacher 1 and teacher 2, let's call them Tana, right? The level of teachers, right? These two people might argue a lot. That's perfectly normal in reading the Mishnah, and especially in reading the Talmud, where they give more of the discussions and arguments that happen. Because two from the same generation are considered to have had the same level of authority. And the same thing, these two students can argue, and these two students can argue, and those 4 students can argue, and that's fine. The bigger question is, can student X argue with teacher 2?
In the same school.
Well, even across schools, it's different if he's arguing by himself and not merely repeating what his teacher told him, right? So, but if student X is arguing with teacher 2, generally speaking, that's a problem. But then the question becomes, what is the nature of the argument? Are they actually arguing with their teacher, or are they holding a position that is different than their teacher for other reasons? And this is where the Gemara does a lot of legwork. And also later on, the Tosafot do a lot of work of trying to figure out why these things happen. Sometimes, and I don't know the particulars of this case, so I can't give the exact answer. Sometimes one of the reasons why student X can argue, in quotes, with teacher 2 is he wasn't arguing with teacher 2. It looks like it because of the editing, but in fact, he was simply stating a position that applies in a different set of circumstances. But it's not always apparent from the Mishnah on the surface. Again, not saying that that's our particular case, but that is a way that the Talmud will often reconcile this. Others can be that student X isn't arguing with teacher 2. It's student X contradicts teacher 2 because student X wasn't a very good student. That student X is holding wrong, that they have gotten the wrong way, the wrong memory of the lesson. Right? So anybody who's ever been a teacher will know that when you teach a group of kids, it sometimes happens that one of those kids will walk out of the room and they will have exactly the wrong idea. Never happens. Never happens. You taught everybody.
It's the fault of the teacher. Yeah.
Well, so this is actually the reason why this is a very interesting topic is that there is a basic problem in all of this, and this is really well put out if you've ever read the Iggeret of Rav Shria HaGaon. It's a wonderful, wonderful book of how all of our oral law works. And he lived in 9th century, 10th century. He was one of the Gaonim that lived in the very end of the Babylonian period, Babylonian Talmud period. Most people only know Sadia Gaon, but he was very, very important, this one, Sharia HaGaon. And he asks this wonderful hypothetical, or not hypothetical, but wonderful practical questions. He says, wait a minute. Why did the students of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai argue so much? Because if they both learned from their teachers, and their teachers, Shammai and Hillel, only had a handful of arguments, why did the students have a basket full of arguments? How could the students have more arguments with each other than the teachers did? Because if they only repeated what the teachers knew, they should only have exactly the same problems that the teachers had. And his answer was they weren't very good students. Now, he gives them credit. He says during that time period, it was hard to be a good student, right? The Jewish world was in turmoil. The students didn't have as much time, didn't have as much strength, didn't have as much ability. So we kind of let them a little bit off the hook. It wasn't that they were just sitting in the back texting rather than paying attention, but they did not capture everything that their teacher said, not to the extent that they didn't remember it, but they didn't remember all the explanations properly. And if you don't remember the explanations for why your teacher taught you what the teacher taught, then when you go to apply it, especially in a new circumstance, you can be off in a new area. And they say that is what happened, why the divisions between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai multiplied. It wasn't because Shammai and Hillel were so far apart. It was because their students drifted far apart because they didn't really capture everything that their teachers wanted them to know. And so it is possible for a student to be in contradiction with a teacher for a number of different reasons. Sometimes it can also be that the student has a logical reason why in many cases their rule would apply that their teacher had not been exposed to. And that comes down to the other side, that although we emphasize Shmuat, the Masorah, the received, the things that you've heard, the English, the core of Jewish learning is remembering precisely what you were taught, right? So when someone says, the pig isn't kosher, you remember, the pig isn't kosher. And that is the nugget that is always true. The gem in the necklace that is always shining. But it's svara, the logic and reasoning is the gold that holds it together to make it a necklace. And there are times when later generations will have an understanding of the gem that makes it shine differently than the previous generation. And that is the very complicated dance throughout Jewish law of keeping that which was transmitted correctly, but also hanging it in the necklace of logic and reason so that it actually fits all together rather than just a collection of rocks in your hand. And there's a tension between logic and received tradition that goes back and forth throughout all of Jewish history.
Makes sense why Tosafot they discuss so much, because Tosafot were all the generation of Rabbi Tam, and they saw that he contradicting Rashi. Now I believe that Rabbi Tam was a good student.
Of course.
So what was the conclusion of the Tosafot? How could they allow Rabbi Tam to contradict his grandpa so many times?
Because he wasn't. Right. I mean, so one of the main jobs of the Tosafot, of the particular group of rabbis that lived in the Middle Ages, and the commentary on Talmud, one of their main jobs was to actually reconcile contradictions. They were the first group to systematically go through the entire Talmud and say, this sentence doesn't seem to match this sentence, 800 pages later. How can we make them work together? How can we make them fit? Because right now it looks like we've got two opposite opinions. And the brilliance of the Tosafot, apart from just basic explanation, was to take these really difficult things and see that if we understand them very carefully and very precisely, and with the entire body of Talmud used as our information source, we can make things that look like opposites actually be the same. And that was the brilliant reasoning capacity that the Tosafot had. So if they saw a contradiction between Rabbi A and Rabbi B, they would try to harmonize them and try to say they're talking about two different things, even though it looked like they were talking about the same thing. Or it would try to be, they're saying the same thing, even though it looks like they said opposite things. They worked very hard to try and bring things back into harmony to make sure. And occasionally they would say, this rabbi was mistaken. Or often they would say, this text was mistaken. This text over here, the rabbi that used this text, there must have been a mistake in it, right? There was a missing word or there was a word added. And that's why he had his opinion. But the better version of the text looks like this. And this is the opinion that should be followed. So they did a lot of the cleanup work when they were doing their analysis. So
what about
the contradicting your teacher, just one last little thing, is really much more about the public embarrassment of your teacher in public. That's where the rabbis are really concerned. That the rabbi says X, Y, and Z, and some student goes, "That's not right. It's PDQ." That's a problem because it tears down the authority and the ability to be believed for the people. But the student can go to the rabbi afterwards and say, "Excuse me, but I had been taught, or I thought you taught me last week, or maybe I misunderstood, but didn't you previously say," and try to help the teacher recognize the mistake, or the student can recognize that he or she misunderstood what the rabbi had originally taught. And it's good that the student has now asking the question because it's a chance for the teacher to set the student right. Yeah.
I think Pirkei actually talks about it. They say machloket, contradiction that is for the sake of Hashem is okay, but if it's not for Hashem, it's not good.
But even if it's for God, even if you are speaking up for God, speaking up against your teacher publicly is considered to be not for God, right? You are damaging the whole structure. Now, if there is a very immediate practical concern, the wrong person is about to be executed, right? Someone is about to eat something that is very obviously treif. There's no ifs, ands, or but. The teacher just made a really big mistake. Then most authorities say, yeah, you can speak up and stop a gross injustice. But if it's just a question of, he said this was that, but I don't think he's right because I relearned this, or I think he contradicted himself, you keep your mouth shut and you talk to the teacher privately.
Not in public.
Not in public. With that in mind, we're actually going to continue on our Pirkei Avot. We're going to talk about teachers and students. It's a very good segue.